Hey guys, Will here. So today we're going to be checking out the GT Racer from Next Level Racing. Now this is one of their more entry-level cockpits in their lineup. Having said that though, it does actually provide a pretty darn good driving experience with a couple of modifications I'm going to be showing you in today's video as well. So let's dive into the GT Racer and see whether this might be the right cockpit for your sim racing setup. Let's go. So as always, before we dive into today's review, just a couple of important bits of information so you have the full context of exactly what we're doing today. So firstly, a big thank you to Next Level Racing for sending across this cockpit for us to check out. Now we were making a few comparisons in today's video against some other cockpits at various different price points, just to kind of give you a better picture of what might suit your needs and budget best overall. So for that reason, it's important that you guys are aware that all the products that we're talking about in today's video have been sent to us under the same conditions. If you do decide you want to pick up any of the gear that we've talked about in today's video or any other sim racing gear, check the links down in the description below or hit up boostedmedia.net for various different discount codes. Now, speaking of discount codes, we do have some discount codes available for this product specifically as well. So we'll get into that now and we'll talk about a bit of pricing information. So this guy comes in at $399 US or $599 if you're in Australia. Now in Australia through Pagnian Imports, which is their sister company, that does include goods and services tax or GST and shipping, which is quite cool. Including shipping for a nice big bulky box like this, it does save you quite a bit of money. So just make sure you do factor that in if you're looking at prices of various different cockpits. But as is always the case, depending on where you are in the world, what's going to be the best value for money for you may vary. So just make sure you're checking your local shipping costs, import duties, and all those important things before you dive in and make a final decision. But look, at $399 US, there's not a whole lot that we've tested here at Boosted Media, at least, that really competes with this directly. We've tested a few other cockpits that you can fold away and store away when not in use, and that comes with its own kind of compromises as well. Obviously, you lose rigidity the more bendy parts that you put into something like this. Whereas this overall is a little bit more rigid than a lot of those cockpits are, but has the disadvantage of, not being able to just pack it away and fold it into a cupboard when it's not in use. So it's the kind of product that's going to get you up and racing, but certainly not the be all and end all when it comes to sim racing cockpits. You can certainly go a lot more high end than this. And with that comes a lot more in terms of things like adjustability, rigidity, and overall adaptability, being able to add bits onto it and whatnot. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if you do invest in a more expensive cockpit, those are the kinds of advantages you're going to get out of that. And you can check out some of our reviews of Next Level Racing products, as well as many other brands right here on the channel if you're interested to see exactly what you get for the extra money. But let's go back to what exactly we get for the money in terms of the GT Racer. Now, this cockpit is suitable for up to 13 Newton meter direct drive wheelbases. We're testing it out with the Moza R12 in today's video at maximum force feedback, and I was actually pretty darn impressed with how it stood up to the force feedback, but we'll talk about that as we get on through today's video. As I mentioned earlier, it does come with a seat as well, which is quite a decent seat. You've got this kind of faux leather material on the sides, you've got the Alcantara style material in the middle and the back, and then you've got some nice red stitching here as well. The overall build quality for the price point does seem quite good. If you're jumping online and researching various different cockpits, you'll see quite a few cockpits that are aluminium profile style that come in at around this kind of price point, but none of those, at least that I'm aware of, that we've tested here at Boosted Media, include a seat. So that does save you quite a bit of money over some of those other options. So that is definitely something that you don't want to get tripped up by. Now, in terms of cockpit reviews, what I usually like to try and do is cover off the three things that we were just talking about before. So adjustability, flexibility or rigidity overall, and then adaptability and what we can add to it in terms of peripherals and whatnot. So let's go through all those things methodically now, starting off with adaptability, or what we can actually mount on this particular cockpit. So let's start off at the top here with the wheel deck. I already mentioned that we're running the Moza R12 here, and that this can handle up to 13 Newton meters of direct drive force feedback strength. So you've got all the standard mounting patterns here for all of your major sim racing brands. We'll flash up on the screen for you now the various different hole patterns that they specify in their manual, but it covers all your major brands like Moza, Simagic, Fanatec, Thrustmaster, Logitech. Basically all the major brands that people that are looking at a cockpit at this kind of price point would likely be purchasing. So you shouldn't have any major issues at all with mounting a wheelbase. We'll come back and talk about adjustment there obviously a little bit later on. Over on the right hand side for us here in Australia, we have the shifter mount. Now that comes with a couple of different plates. Again, we didn't have any problems mounting any of the major brands, so your Moza, your Simagic, your Fanatec, your Thrustmaster, and so forth. It is a little bit fiddly to mount some combinations with the secondary plates, simply because you have to bolt the shifter or the handbrake in from underneath, and then you have this kind of standoff system that mounts to the main plate. And look, at first I was quite critical of it simply because it was a little bit fiddly, but then when I thought about it, I'm like, well, I can't really think of an easier way of doing this that would still give you as much in terms of different mounting options. So I can't really be too critical of that overall. There is quite a bit of flex in that shifter mount, as we'll get onto later on in today's review. But just so you guys know, in terms of adaptability here, you can mount the shifter arm either on the left or the right hand side, depending on how you want to set things up. And you do have some adjustability up and down here as well, as we'll discuss in just a moment. And then we move on down to the pedal tray. Now, adjustability is an important factor here, so we'll definitely spend some time on that in just a minute. But in terms of mounting options here, you do have hole patterns for all of the major brands. Once again, we'll flash the chart up on the screen for you now. When it comes to adjustability here, that is where it does create some limitations in terms of what kinds of pedals you can use. Now, a lot of pedals on the market have an angle already built into the pedals. So say your Logitech, your more entry-level Thrustmaster, or any of the current Fanatec pedals, those are all absolutely fine. But when we tried out some of the SimMagic pedals, for example, because of the angle that those pedals are at, even with the adjustability that they do offer, we weren't able to get the pedals to sit down enough to account for the angle here, and therefore the pedals were just far too upright, and you can't get your ankles into a sensible position to actually drive with those pedals. So while you do have a lot of adaptability in terms of the pedals that you can physically mount to the plate because of the hole patterns that they have here, when it comes to the adjustability, you are a lot more limited in the pedal sets that you can use. But once again, in the kind of price range that we're looking at for a cockpit like this, most of the pedals that you'll be looking at are okay. And again, you can reference the chart on the screen again now to see exactly what pedals are compatible. One exception to that, I would say, would be the Moza CRP pedals, although it does say that those are compatible. Again, we had issues with the pedals just being too far upright to really be drivable with this particular setup. And that brings us quite nicely into adjustability. So let's continue on here talking about the pedals, then we'll work our way back up and go through the entire system. Now, as with a lot of other non-aluminium profile style cockpits, what you make in terms of adjustment in one area does have a knock-on effect throughout the entire rig. So straight away here, because of the angle of the pedals, you are limited in the seating positions that you can use here. Now, obviously, different people will have different body shapes, different body sizes and whatnot, but you can't set these flat and you can't tilt them more upright than what you have here either. So this isn't really suitable for a more formula style seating position. You are going to be limited to that more street or more GT style seating position. So just make sure that you are aware of that if you're spending more time driving sort of formula style rigs. If you're spending most of your time in, say, the F1 games, for example, you might want to look at something like the FGT or something like that, which we reviewed previously, which will give you that more formula-style seating position for a little bit more immersion, a little bit more authenticity. So you can move most pedal sets forward and back a little bit on this plate, but there's not a whole lot of adjustment range here once you factor in the fact that you don't want the pedals to be smacking into the uprights here. So it is going to just depend on the pedal set that you're looking to use. And the reason we've got the Moza wheelbase paired with the Fanatec pedals, just so you know, is that I actually really rate these pedals very highly. I think they're the best value for money pedal set on the market right now. So if you're looking at stepping up to load cell style pedals, I would definitely recommend you check out the review that we did of this particular pedal set. I'll link it down in the description box below for you. So just while we're discussing the pedal plate here, I was actually surprised with how rigid this is, but we'll circle back and discuss that when we get into rigidity in just a moment. Let's move up now to the wheel deck again. Let's talk about adjustability here. Now, if you've watched any of our other more recent Next Level Racing entry-level cockpit reviews, you would have seen I've been quite critical of the adjustment mechanism that they use on a lot of their entry-level rigs, simply because of the amount of flex that they introduce. Now, I'm happy to report, as we'll discuss in just a minute, that there is actually minimal flex in the wheel deck itself on this particular rig. But in saying that, you do sacrifice a little bit in terms of overall adjustability, but they have done quite a good job here. You can see they've got this kind of hole pattern in the side here and some holes along the top here too. Now, you can actually adjust these uprights forward and backwards as well, depending on your height. They say put it in the further back position if you're under 170 centimeters, and move it into the last position here if you're over 170 up to about 190. And they say that this is suitable for up to 2 meters in height, which is pretty darn tall. So you shouldn't have too many issues in terms of getting things into a proper driving position. Now, in terms of adjustment for the actual wheel deck itself, you can see it actually bolts in through these holes here. So you can move it forward and back within the scope of adjustment here. And that ends up being about 2.5 inches of movement. So you could move this forward 1 slot if you needed to from where we have it here, or back 2 slots, each one being about 1 inch in adjustment. You can also adjust the angle here through these various different hole patterns too. So you can have it completely flat relative to the mounting surface here. You can actually have it tilted down slightly if you wanted to as well. Although I can't really see a scenario where that would be useful because of the fixed angle of the pedal plate, as we were just discussing before. But you can get plenty of angle upright here, and I didn't have any issues at all with the position. You can also raise and lower it a little bit as well. I've got this in the lowest position at the moment, but I could actually raise that up by about another 1.5 inches if I wanted to. So I would say overall a good amount of adjustment here without sacrificing too much in terms of the overall rigidity of the wheel deck, unlike what we've said about a lot of their other entry-level cockpits that use that clamping mechanism, which does just inherently have a lot of flex in the design itself. So happy to see that they've gone a different direction from that design that we've been critical of in the past. So back to the shifter mount again, you can move this forward and back on the little arm here, depending on the position you want. You can move it up and down, and of course switch it between left and right as well. So you've got a decent amount of adjustment here, and that is important because a lot of different shifters and handbrakes have different heights, and it can be quite challenging to actually get those into a comfortable position a lot of the time. But as you can see here, I was able to get the shifter and the handbrake pretty much in line with the steering wheel, give or take an inch or two, and it was absolutely perfectly fine and comfortable in terms of the driving position. Then we move across to the seat. Now, we do have included in the price, which I think is quite cool, a seat slider mechanism. So you can actually move the seat forward and back. And that is very important given, again, the fixed position that we have with the pedal tray. And hopefully you're starting to see what I was saying here about the knock-on effect between what you do in one place, meaning that you have to adjust things in other areas. You can imagine if you have your seat all the way back, then you might also need to move your shifter further back, move your wheel deck further back to just get your legs in the right position to use the pedals, given that they're in a fixed position. So hopefully that makes sense. Definitely a good thing that they include that seat slider. You do also have a reclining mechanism here on the seat as well. And just to give you the visual reference here, you can adjust this seat all the way between Toyota Camry driving position, all the way back to Subaru WRX or Golf GTI driving positions. So plenty of adjustment available there. And that is pretty much everything you need to know in terms of the adjustability and adaptability of the rig. Obviously, they don't have mounting positions for additional accessories like button boxes and whatnot, but you know, you can generally fabricate something with various different clamps that you can get from a hardware store. And I don't think too many people would be complaining about that at this kind of price point, but those are the kinds of things that, you know, spending more on an aluminium profile style cockpit will add in terms of adaptability. So if those kinds of things are important to you, then those are definitely considerations. Also, no provision here for an integrated monitor stand or integrated keyboard and mouse tray either. So you will need to have standalone options for those things as well. But I think that's everything you guys need to know now in terms of adjustability and adaptability. Let's move on now into rigidity. Okay, so normally this is the part of video where I would sort of go through the entire cockpit methodically and demonstrate flex in various different areas, and then we would break, talk about the driving experience overall, and then wrap things up with conclusions. What I want to do here is a little bit differently, simply because I feel like it's really difficult in these reviews to convey the difference between what you guys are seeing on camera in terms of flex and what I'm actually perceiving when I'm driving in terms of flex. So we're going to kind of bring everything together in this, and we'll talk about the driving experience as we go through and talk about the flex, so we can kind of relate everything back to each other. Now, I don't want it to sound like I'm making any excuses for the flex that we do have here. I don't want it to sound like I'm going easy on them or anything like that, because there definitely are some significant areas where I think they could have improved things on this rig. And this has been a bit of a theme with some of the more entry-level next level racing products for a while now. I always come away from it feeling like they've done overall a pretty good job, but there's just a couple of things they could have done that are relatively simple changes that could have really made the product a lot better overall. So let's go through it all now. Now, the elephant in the room here is obviously these ratchet straps that you guys have been able to see for the entire review. And I've left them on there intentionally because I wanted to draw attention to just how much of a difference this actually does make to the driving experience overall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to release these just quickly now, take the tension off them just a little bit so they're not actually doing anything. We'll pop this out and do the same thing on this side too. There we go. So the tension is off them now. And what you'll see here is when I push down on the brake, the entire frame bends in the middle here. And this is kind of, given the design of the frame, everything kind of just works together in unison here. So if I push really hard on the brake, you can see the entire frame bends up. Now, in a similar manner here, the way I engage with the steering wheel also either adds or subtracts rigidity from the rig overall as well. So although this is not something that you should ever be doing, realistically, let's be honest, a lot of us do have a habit of death gripping the wheel and kind of really putting our shoulders and everything into it and pushing into the wheel as we drive. So when I push into the wheel, you can see it has the exact same effect as if I'm pushing hard on the pedals. The rig tends to sort of want to bend upwards in the middle there. And then conversely to that, if you pull the wheel towards you, you can see the entire rig bends very, very freely. And that looks absolutely terrible on camera, I know. But realistically, when you actually have your heels on the pedal plate and you're engaging into driving, so particularly under braking scenarios, for example, when you're actually creating that rigidity between your butt and your foot, like what I was talking about with braking, you can see now when I pull the steering wheel towards me, there's actually very little flex there, if any at all. So you can see what I'm saying here. The wheel deck itself is actually really solid. It's the flex inherent in the rig overall, particularly in that area down there where you're going to notice flex when driving overall. So what I found is, when I was cornering under acceleration, it does actually feel quite flexy a lot of the time, but when I'm braking, it feels very, very rigid. Now, what I found is that inconsistency in the driving experience overall did actually have quite a large impact on my consistency on track as well. So I was looking at ways that I could add rigidity to the rig overall in that regard. And what I came up with was a very simple solution here, just simply to add some ratchet straps like what you see here. And all we need to do is literally just loop that between the seat rail here and the upright, and try to have it in as straight a line as you possibly can. Add a little bit of tension there, you can see, just to the point where it starts to make the cockpit want to do a wheelie, but not too much, of course. And then do exactly the same thing on the opposing side as well. Add a little bit of tension. And these straps, I think they're only about 15 bucks each from the local hardware store. So it wasn't a massive amount of expense here. So now that we have these straps here, obviously it's not going to make any difference to anything that's going on in terms of pulling the wheel towards us, but with our heels on the pedal plate, that's not too much of an issue anyway, as we just discussed. But now, when I push away from me, that actually adds a significant amount of additional rigidity. And you can see now when I brake, even if I really get into the brake pedal and push way beyond the kind of forces that even I would be using under real life conditions. And I normally brake with about 70 or so kilograms of force, which is probably a lot more than most people that are using this kind of style of a driving rig would ever be putting through the pedals, even with a pedal set like this. You can see now it's not trying to really bend up in the middle at all, simply because of the rigidity that those straps are giving me. And what that translated to in terms of the driving experience was I was actually over a second quicker around Mount Panorama just doing GT3 laps back to back with these straps on here, simply because it wasn't moving around, it wasn't giving me that inconsistency in the driving experience overall. So that little mod there, $30 mod between the two sides, did really transform the driving experience and take it from something that was quite disappointing in a few ways to something that I actually was quite impressed with for the money. As I mentioned a couple of times now, the wheel deck itself is actually really solid. The pedal tray, as you can see, is really solid as well. In terms of, dip or flex when you actually push into the pedal tray, very, very solid there overall. No real flex in that pedal tray whatsoever. It's when you add all those elements together that you start to introduce some flex into the system. Now, there is still one area that is quite flexy, and that is the seat back itself. So given the adjustability that you have here, that's always going to be a compromise. For that reason, I would like to see them sell a version of this cockpit that maybe comes with a fixed back seat, because that would give you a little bit of additional rigidity there. Again, that's going to come at the compromise of lack of adjustability. So it's purely just going to be down to, what you would personally prefer there. But I always think it's a good thing to have some additional options. But you can see as I lean back into the seat, there is quite a bit of movement there. I mean, I'm not really putting a lot of effort. It's hard to sort of, convey this on camera, but I'm not putting a lot of effort into moving back and forth here, and you can see just how much I'm bouncing. When you're driving, obviously when you push into the brake pedal or when you push into the steering wheel, that force is being exerted out the back through your butt and through your back. So any flex that you have in the seat back will obviously have an impact on the consistency of your braking and whatnot. So that's actually one of the reasons I actually removed the seat rails from my daily driver rig. And even though that was a sacrifice in terms of adjustability, if other people want to use the rig, I just wanted to have things as rigid as they could possibly be at pretty much any cost. So that's how important it is to me in my daily driver rig. And that's the reason why I think it's an important consideration here too. But look, the flex and the seat back aside, the interface between your body, the pedals and the steering wheel is actually, I would say, punching above its weight in terms of price point with that modification. Where things do start to fall over again a little bit though is the shifter and handbrake mount. Now, I know a lot of people will be watching this and probably already thought to themselves, why is he using such a high-end shifter and handbrake on an entry-level rig? Surely that's a little bit unfair. Now, the activation force or the amount of effort that it requires to actually activate this shifter and handbrake isn't actually all that much compared to, say, your Fanatec and your Thrustmaster shifter and handbrakes, for example. So I thought something like this would give us the best overall representation of what you can expect out of the experience using this, given that, most people are pulling beyond the force that is actually required to activate anyway, because when you're in the heat of a rally or something like that, you kind of end up slamming away at the shifter and the handbrake anyway. So look, I mean, it's really going to come as no surprise to anybody given the design of this thing that there is quite a bit of flex here. Obviously, you just have the one steel tube coming off the edge here. You don't have any sort of bracing back to the rig at all. So it is going to move around quite a bit. Look, I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. When you're driving, you definitely notice the flex in here. And that is inherent in the driving experience, regardless of whether you're using something like a Logitech driving force shifter or something more high-end like this. So the experience is pretty much the same throughout here. It really just comes down to how much physical force you put into that device as you're using it, but definitely detracts from the overall experience. And look, I think it comes back to, I mean, you could make excuses that for the price point, it's acceptable. And you know, that's going to be a subjective thing. The angle that I'm kind of coming at this is more, for the money, could they have done a better job? And I feel like they probably could have. I feel like some sort of additional bracing here is warranted overall to improve that experience. Now, there was one other issue that we encountered here as well, which is a pretty major one. And that is that we found that regardless of how much we tightened them, of course, given the fact that the more you tighten it, all you're doing is just squishing the steel tube. You're not actually physically making the bolt any tighter against the frame beyond a certain point. But what we found is that those bolts did work their way loose over time, and it didn't take a lot of time for that to happen either. We're talking, you know, 5 to 10 minutes of pretty hardcore rally driving. This whole thing was just flopping around like crazy, as well as the mount on the arm itself back to the cockpit. Now, we did do a little bit of experimenting here with a few different options to add rigidity. Things like star washers or even nylock nuts definitely did significantly improve the experience overall. So again, like I feel like those are simple little things that wouldn't add a lot of additional costs. I mean, star washers probably don't even cost any more than the washers that they include here. And that did reduce the tendency for things to work their way loose over time. So little minor changes like that, I think overall would add to the driving experience and, you know, make it something that is more acceptable for the price point, I would say. But definitely as it stands right now, the shifter and handbrake mount for this is the weakest point on the rig overall, closely followed by the seat back. And then the rest of it honestly is pretty darn good for the money. So look, I think to summarize the driving experience overall, I think if this is your first step up into a cockpit style system and you're sort of tossing up between a folding style cockpit or something like this, I definitely would say that against any of the folding style cockpits that we've tested, with the exception of some of the Coffee Racer rigs, which we reviewed just recently, if you're looking at a cockpit that you can fold up and put away in a cupboard, then this definitely does provide a better overall driving experience in terms of rigidity and all the advantages that come with that. So more consistency on track, more consistency in braking feel, less of a damping effect on your force feedback, for example, as well. So if you're willing to make the compromise in terms of practicality and being able to fold something away, I would certainly be spending my money on something like this as a permanent installation over something like that if I had the choice between the two, but it's going to be just purely down to your own personal circumstances. Overall, I think this does a really good job. It is a significant improvement from the majority of desk setups. That isn't something that I say for every single setup either. I've often questioned whether it's actually worth looking at something like a folding cockpit or whether just having your wheel mounted to your table and your pedals underneath offers a better experience overall. And it can be pretty touch and go off in cases with those kinds of setups, whereas this definitely does provide a significant step up in the driving experience. And most of it comes down to the overall rigidity that we have in the wheel deck, and particularly the pedal tray here. I do feel like they've done a pretty darn good job overall. And look, I would say the wheel deck itself certainly is up to the task of handling that 13 Newton meters of peak force, as it says on the tin. Really, the weak spot in this rig, as you guys have seen demonstrated in today's video, is just that linkage between the two halves of the rigs, which obviously they need to do to allow it to be packaged into a smaller box. But look, I mean, that's the weak spot. It is relatively easily overcome for the most part by a couple of simple ratchet straps like this. Whether or not they should have included something like that in the box, I'll let you guys decide for yourselves. It is a simple fix to a pretty major problem on this rig, but thankfully it's not an overly expensive fix either. So I would say if you're buying one of these rigs or you already own one of these rigs, if you haven't already experimented with that, definitely get down to the local hardware store, buy yourself some ratchet straps. Don't need expensive ones. You don't need to put a lot of force in it because you don't need it to be sort of bending back towards you. You just need to have that little bit of additional rigidity there that stops it from bending away from you when you push into the pedal. So just lastly, before we close off here, I think it's important to also just quickly discuss how the driving experience here compares to some more expensive options. We already talked about some of those folding cockpits. How does this compare to something like a Playseat Trophy, for example? The other one I know a lot of people will be wondering about too is the new Fanatec CS a cell cockpit. Unfortunately, Fanatec have told us that they don't want us to review that product. So we'll have to see what happens there, but unfortunately, I can't give you a comparison with that particular product this time. But we have, of course, tested things like aluminium profile cockpits from entry level all the way through to extremely high end, as well as things like the Playseat Trophy as well. Now, the Playseat Trophy is an interesting one because it is a little bit more than double the cost of this. And look, in terms of the overall driving experience, isn't really all that much different. I would say their implementation of their handbrake and shifter mounts is significantly better than what we have here. In terms of things like the rigidity of the pedal tray, the wheel deck and whatnot, not massively different. Quite a radically different design in the seat as well, which in my experience at least doesn't have as much flex as this does, but is maybe a little bit less comfortable than this seat is overall. It's kind of almost more like a camping chair, for example, than what we have here. So I would definitely encourage you, check out that review. Overall, we were quite impressed with that product, but I did feel like it was a little bit expensive for what you're getting in terms of value for money compared to some other options, because at that kind of price point, you are comparing against more entry-level aluminium profile cockpits, including the cost of the additional seat, which you need to purchase for most of those. Whereas at this kind of price point, it is a significant jump up to something like that. The Playseat Trophy does have a lot more adjustability in terms of pedal position, but look, at the end of the day, the rigidity that you have here overall, at least with the pedals and the wheel, is pretty darn impressive. And I do think that it does punch above its weight with the little mods that we discussed in today's video. And I think it's as simple as that, guys. So if you're gonna buy one of these things, or if you're looking at buying one of these things, I don't think you're gonna be disappointed. Spending a little bit of extra money to make that mod. Hopefully it's something that they can implement in a more professional manner in the product in the future. Maybe we'll see a V2 that has some kind of bracing. But look, overall, I've got to say, I'm pretty impressed with the product overall for the price point. I'm not gonna give it the full thumbs up simply because I do think that there's a couple of simple things that they could have done here that would have drastically improved the final product. And I do feel like there's not really an excuse for not doing those things. It feels a little bit unfinished for that reason. If it wasn't for that, I would be giving it a thumbs up. But look, it's certainly not a thumbs down either. I think for the price, most people are going to be at least satisfied, if not impressed with the product. And it's as simple as that, guys. So if you're looking at picking one of these up or anything else that we've talked about in today's video or any other sim racing gear, check those links down in the description below for our discount codes and to help support the channel at no additional cost. We do very much appreciate your support there as always. But above all, guys, thank you very much for watching. Please do leave a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss out on future videos like this one. I know recently we've been a little bit more focused on more high-end sim racing gear. It's just the way it goes sometimes. We go through kind of waves of being sent more expensive stuff and then, you know, more entry-level stuff. It just kind of, you know, comes and goes. But we do have quite a few more affordable things coming up in the pipeline here at Boosted Media. So definitely subscribe so you don't miss out on those videos. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you again soon. Bye.